Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. I'm joined, as I always am, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back for another round of Libertarian Angle.
Great to be here and with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, well, we got, of course, a new president, Donald Trump, who is pledging to wage a trade war against China and who knows who else. So, Richard, we're back to the basic principles that we libertarians have been emphasizing for umpteen years. Now with a new administration, we always have to do this, of course, with Democratic regimes, but we also have to do them with Republican regimes because they don't really seem to grasp fundamental economic principles and the principles that lead to a dynamic and prosperous economy. And one of these fundamental areas is with respect to trade. So here we have a president that's now going to embark on policies that are going to destined to bring more economic suffering and economic impoverishment, not just to the people in the countries that are targeted, but also to people here in the United States. And the prime example is Trump's upcoming trade war against China. So why don't I turn the ball over to you, and you go first on this issue.
Well, I think that the starting point is to realize that international trade, foreign trade, is just an extension of the benefits and the logic of trade between individuals within the same country. It goes back to Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. Individuals have limited abilities to satisfy all of their own wants, desires, and needs through their own physical labor, their mental skills and abilities, and whatever, by luck, resources might be around themselves for their utilization to achieve those personal and individual ends. So rather than be left with a life of narrow standard of living with self-sufficiency, men soon discover mutual gains from trade. You have something that I want, I have something that you want, or you can produce something that I could not produce myself, and vice versa. I can produce something perhaps that you cannot easily produce for yourself, either in terms of the quality of the product, the time involved in producing it, the resources that would be used up, and each of us sees a mutual gain from trade. I will give up that which I value less highly to acquire that which I value more highly, and you will be reciprocally doing the exact same thing. And each of us, therefore, gains from this trade and exchange by having, as the economists refer to it, a positive sum game. Both of us are better off. We've given up what we value less highly to acquire something that we value more highly. Now, that logic, that simple logic between two individuals, is extended to 3 people, 4 people, 100 people, 10,000 people, 1 million people, 1 billion people. The only thing that distinguishes the trade between you and me in a one-to-one exchange is the fact that with international trade, we're separated by more distance, and governments have artificially put these lines on the map of the world defining political jurisdiction as to what government has sovereignty over what territory. And on that basis, they then differentiate and discriminate and distinguish between who are appropriate to be viewed as citizens and traders within a geographical area and who are not. But the same thing applies. Adam Smith, again, argued that by participating in this trading process, each of us is made better off. And each of us must devote our energies and our efforts to making a product that our neighbor wants, that they would willingly take in trade. That's the benefits from the division of labor and open competitive markets. Now, that was a long battle to win intellectually and then policy-wise for hundreds of years, from around the 1500s into the 17 and into the 1800s. Governments followed a policy called mercantilism. And this policy was grounded in the idea that it is the duty and the responsibility and indeed the right of governments to determine not only what goods get produced within their political jurisdiction, but what goods may be imported, what goods may be exported, what type of subsidies a government might give to foster exports, what barriers they would place in the way of preventing goods from being imported into the home country. And only after a long battle from the time of around Adam Smith in the late decades of the 1700s into the middle of the 19th century, the mid 1800s, did finally there occur the achievement of the logic and the implementation of free trade policies in countries like Great Britain, and then of course the United States was more or less founded on those principles. And what has been the outcome? When men can specialize in what they're best at and trade their skills with their neighbor, all of us are mutually better off. Now, if one understands these basic core concepts of why trade is good, and individuals should be left free to decide what trades are most beneficial for them, one can now approach these issues that Donald Trump has raised. Now, the difficulty of dealing with this is not the complexity of the issue or even the rightness of the free trade position, but he has confused and misunderstood and misrepresented so many logical understandings and factual matters that one doesn't know where to begin. So let me start off with this issue that he said that the world is sucking jobs out of the United States, and that America is being left as a consumer of other people's goods, but seemingly a producer of either nothing or worthless goods. This has particularly been the case when he's talked about Mexico or China, for instance. But the fact is, trade is a two-way matter. The only reason one exports anything is to have the ability to be able to import things that one cannot produce for oneself or as well as someone else can. Let's take the simplest example of myself. I'm a professor of economics at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, I specialize in this because I like to think this is a niche of expertise at which I have a valuable market skill that others are willing to pay for. And I do so to earn money. Now, why do I take the time to devote my teaching and writing skills to earning money? So to have the financial wherewithal to then turn around and re-enter the market as a consumer myself and to buy all the goods and services that I desire and want that others can provide me with, which I might not be able to provide myself with at all if I was dependent upon my own self-sufficient labors. So in other words, I export my teaching skills, for which the Citadel pays me a salary. So I have the means and the wherewithal to then undertake a policy of importing. Now, the United States does the same thing. What do we export? We export sometimes agricultural goods, high-tech items, various electronics of various sorts. And what do we do with the revenues that we have earned by these exports? To have the ability to purchase these imports. So imports are the benefit of trade. Exports are the cost of trade. And that totally reverses how people like Donald Trump talk about this. They think the gain is selling things and the amount of people employed making these things, where it is exactly the opposite. What we would like to do is to be able to buy as much as we can of the goods and services we desire at the least cost, so that our labor and our resources and our time are freed up to do other things besides paying for the things that others can provide us with at lower costs or in better qualities than if we did so ourselves. So the gains from trade are from the goods that we buy from Mexico, the goods that we buy from China, for instance. Now the other matter here is that let us suppose that we were to impose various types of trade barriers or to renegotiate the NAFTA treaty. And I'm not defending NAFTA. It's a political document. It's not a free trade agreement. But if we were to restrict further trade with China and Mexico, first of all, how would we do this? Well, the United States government would either have to impose tariff or import duty barriers on these goods. Trump has talked about a 40 or 45% tariff on Chinese goods. That immediately impacts upon every American consumer of those goods. Anyone who was buying a product, let's say for $1 today from China, would now end up having to pay $1.45 for the same product tomorrow if Trump's threat of an import wall against Chinese goods were to be imposed. Now, there's another matter this. And that is, if we restrict the Chinese to be able to export their goods to the United States, or because of the tariff wall, less gets sold because of the greater expense for the American consumer to buy it, those in China earn less dollar revenues. Now, dollars are not spent in China. Dollars are not spent in the Eurozone. They are the dominant medium of exchange in the U.S. So what will the Chinese do then with the income that they've earned in dollar revenues? The vast majority will then be spent back in the United States in buying American goods. Now, why would they want to buy these American goods of various and sundry types? Because the only motive for them to export to us is to earn the dollars so they can import things from the U.S. that they desire. Now, there's one other element of this that I want to touch upon. And that is, why is it advantageous to take advantage of what foreign competitors can offer to us as American consumers? It raises our standard of living. How does it do so? Let us suppose that I've been buying an American version of a product for $10. And now some foreign seller, it could be in Mexico or China or out of Slovakia, some foreign seller now has devised a way to make a product less costly. And even with the transportation expenses of bringing it to the United States, they can sell their version of this product that I've been buying for $10 from an American seller for $5. That raises my standard of living. I now am able to buy something at half the price that it usually costs me, and I now have $5 left in my pocket to spend on other things. And that means that I now can increase my demand for other goods and services that previously were beyond my financial reach when I was having to pay more for the good that I'm now buying from the foreign seller. That raises my demand for alternative goods. That creates demand and profits in other parts of the U.S. economy. And to the extent that the American competitor cannot match that new foreign, less costly seller, then my ability to shift my spending in another direction, because I'm now saving money by buying the foreign version, means that there are new employment opportunities, new profit opportunities to make things that previously I couldn't afford, which I now can. And that means alternative jobs are available. No jobs on net are lost. No businesses are necessarily completely out of business forever, never to be returned. Now, it is true that with all change, there might have to be a change in the composition of what employments are available, what products are made, a growth of some sectors of the economy, a decline of others. But that's the price of all change, even if all of these improvements were coming domestically. Some industries grow, some decrease. Resources and labor have to shift where they work and what they're doing, and maybe the location and where they live to do the work. But the fact is, that's just the normal transformative shifts and adjustments to improvements in a world of change. But to deny us these opportunities is either to prevent or slow down or reverse the standards of living we enjoy. And all of this has been either misunderstood or presented in a totally falsified way to create the impression that someone like Donald Trump is going to make America great by making us poorer. We are poorer by keeping out the foreign goods. We are poorer by preventing us from taking advantage of a higher standard of living that international trade offers us. We are poorer by not adapting to new cost efficiencies in technologies, whether made at home or abroad, that in the long run cumulatively improve the qualities and the quantities of everyone's standards of living. And this is one of the most egregious mistakes, in my humble opinion, that has arisen from both the candidacy and now the triumph of Donald Trump. It will be a disaster if, as a result of this, he is able, with the support of Republican majorities in both houses of Congress, the imposition of any of these threatened trade wars.
Yeah, I'm glad you started out the discussion with Adam Smith's treatise, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. I've often, thought about how profound that title of the book is, The Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. What is it that causes some nations to be wealthier than other nations? Is it natural resources? Is it education? You know, I grew up on the border, as you know, Richard, in Laredo, Texas, and it always intrigued me as a kid that as poor as Laredo was, and there was tremendous poverty in Laredo, man, it was nothing compared to when you just crossed the Rio Grande into Nuevo Laredo, and the poverty was 100 times worse. You know, so I wondered what was it about the river that caused this disparity in living standards. Well, Smith gave us the answer to this, and so have the classical economists and the Austrian economists, that a wealthy, prospering nation depends, one, on productivity. I mean, the more productive people are, the higher standard of living will be, the better the wage rates, the real wage rates. That it's natural. When people become more productive, the businesses they're working for are making more money. Therefore, there's more wealth to pay higher wages. There's more goods and services for people. So it stands to it's logical that increased productivity is one of the causes of the wealth of nations. But there's also the concept of trade, as you pointed out, that even if, let's say, you have a rudimentary society where there's no businesses, there's no industry, there's no manufacturing, let's just say a bunch of tribes, that all of a sudden discover another tribe in a neighboring region, that they can raise their standard of living just through the act of trade, even if there's no businesses manufacturing things. And why is that? Well, as you point out, because in every trade, people are going to benefit from the trade, both sides, from their own subjective perspective. Otherwise, why would they enter into the trade? They enter into the trade because they're giving up something they value less for something they value more. So that you can have increases in the standard of living just through the simple act of exchange. And as you point out, on a one-to-one basis. But that one-to-one basis can be a person who lives next door to you. It can be a person that lives in the next county, the next state, or the next country. That whoever you're trading with, you're increasing your standard of living. So the more people that are out there offering things to you in trade, the better off you are, because the better opportunity you have to raise your standard of living through trade. So the corollary of this principle is that to the extent that government is interfering with any peaceful exchange, to that extent the government is interfering with and obstructing your ability to increase your standard of living. And that's exactly what all these protectionist measures do. Now, we have to compare, though, what's happening here. You're dealing with producers and consumers, and you've got the interests of producers that are, in many instances, contrary to the interests of consumers. It's the interest of a producer to have higher prices. He gets more revenue. It's the interest of the consumer to have a lower prices. Well, what should be the policy of a government? Well, the policy of a government should be freedom, which ordinarily orients toward the consumer. That is to say that when you have a protectionist barrier, you're really trying to benefit a business that's saying, hey, look, I'm losing market share here to these Chinese competitors or to the competitors in the neighboring county or the neighboring state. I want you to pass a law, as you point out, that protects me from that competition. Put a tax on the guy, the Chinese, is selling that product for $5 so that now his product's going to cost $11. That will mean Americans will have to buy from me at $10. Well, yeah, it benefits him, keeps him in business, but under principles of free trade, the person that is being harmed is the consumer. He's the one that is having his money taken away from him and effectively being given for the benefit of the producer. While, as you point out, why shouldn't he be free to buy the object for $5 and then have the other $5 to spend and buy on other things, thereby improving his standard of living? So this is what we're faced with, Richard. I mean, you're faced with a government, with a lobby, with an interest groups that are really trying to protect American businesses from the vicissitudes of competition. But the people who are paying the price for this is everyone in their role as consumers. Now, those are the economic consequences. I think we should also emphasize the freedom consequences of this, that these trade restrictions, these trade wars are an assault not just on the Chinese or the Cubans, who have been suffering under an embargo. It's not only causing suffering for those people, and it's also not only causing suffering for the American people, because they're going to retaliate. The Chinese are going to impose their own trade restrictions on American goods being imported into China. But it's also an assault on our freedom as Americans, our economic liberty, our fundamental right, as Thomas Jefferson put it in the Declaration of Independence, to pursue happiness in our own way. And part of that happiness is spending our own money our own way, improving our standard of living, and entering into trades with people freely, exchanging what belongs to us for goods that belong to them. That's an essential core aspect of economic liberty, and that's what they destroy with these trade restrictions.
Yes, I think it's important. Your point here is very crucial, and if I can sort of amplify or just re-emphasize it, and that is that the presumption in these regulations over international trade is that the government is going to intrude and decide with whom you may trade or associate. Now, freedom of association, freedom of exchange have been core principles of the entire ideal of a free and open society. Who you can interact with, who you can exchange ideas with, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association. The only difference between those and freedom of the marketplace, freedom of exchange, is that in this case, it's not just two people talking and sharing ideas through verbal communications. It's two individuals using their mental abilities and their skills to manifest their capacities in a product and to then offer it in exchange to another individual. So in fact, the principle of freedom of association that we take for granted when it applies to a political meeting or a religious congregation and so on is no different in the marketplace, is an exchanging of two people's visions of what they would like to have, which they communicate to another, and from which they gain mutually from it. All other things are infringements upon that. I know that you have often said that there was an amendment missing from the Constitution, and that was just as there's a separation of church and state, there should have been an amendment added to the Bill of Rights from the start, separating government from the economy, the political from the market. And to do so would be and should be considered as fundamental essential to the liberty and autonomy and the freedom of choice of the distinct human being about whose dignity we say we cherish and value, as freedom of speech and freedom of press and freedom of assembly and freedom of religion. It is a way of expressing oneself of what one can do and what one desires and can acquire to improve their life as they are defining it in relation to their associations with other human beings, whether those other human beings are their neighbors in the same country or by accidents of history and circumstance, those who reside on the other side of a political boundary.
All right, well, let's talk about prospects for success. Because, you and I are talking about these concepts of free trade, and somebody might say, oh, this is nice, but it's pie in the sky. We're going to have an administration in there that's totally committed to economic protectionism and trade wars. But yet, Richard, as you know, there's been times in history where ideas matter, where ideas have brought a shift in the course of direction of a society. When Smith was writing The Wealth of Nations, and after he wrote it, I think it was you that pointed out to me once that his sentiment was, oh, well, this will never be translated into policy. It's just so impossible. Mercantilism is so firmly established in the British Empire. Yes. And yet within a relatively short period of time, he wrote the book in 1776. By the early 1800s, mid-1800s, you had the free trade movement in Great Britain, led by Richard Cobden and John Bright, who were bringing free trade and were assisted by the poor, who were understanding the logic of the argument about how it was hurting them. And so there was
Yes.
really this revolution taking place in England, right? Through the power of ideas.
Yes, absolutely. As I think as I put it in some things I've written and addressing in these issues in public, is that The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776. And in what the chapter you're referring to, after Smith gives his detailed criticisms and critique of the government system of central planning of that time known as mercantilism, he ends it in despondency. He says it is as likely to ever see a regime of free trade in Great Britain as it would be to see a utopia. And he said that this was due to two factors, the prejudices of the public and the power of the interests. By prejudices of the public, he meant merely the difficulty that sometimes people have in understanding the logic of how markets work, the seeming counterintuitiveness that if you buy foreign goods, you create a rising standard of living and more employment opportunities for the people in your home country. And he felt that was a barrier. Now, it is difficult sometimes for people to understand the economic arguments, but it's not impossible. What is required is reasoned logic presented in commonsensical and persuasive ways. The standard example of this, of the most outstanding voice for these ideas, was, of course, the French free market classical liberal economist of the early 19th century, Frederick Bastiat. No one had a greater clarity and satirical humor and commonsensical way of explaining the principles of free trade and free enterprise and the absurdities and counterproductive consequences of all forms of protectionism and trade barriers and regulations and controls. Now, Adam Smith died in 1790. And he had put out a final version of his book shortly before he died, and he didn't change his sentiment in that part of the book where he expresses his despair of ever seeing free trade in Great Britain. But the fact was, as you just said, within one generation, that is by the early and mid 1840s, at least in Great Britain, all the trade barriers were lowered or abolished, so that for all intents and purposes, from 1846 on, until the First World War virtually, Great Britain had a regime of almost absolute unrestricted freedom of trade. Now, the other element in Smith's argument was what he called the power of the interests, which he just means special interests who eat at the trough of government favors, privileges, subsidies, and protections, including trade barriers, and will fight tooth and nail to preserve them from any threat of their disbandment, and to do everything in their power to see that they're increased. In fact, Smith says that the person who speaks the truth about freedom of trade is likely to be the target for ridicule and misrepresentation and even personal harm, from the advocates of these government restrictions. But again, the fact is that within one generation after Smith's passing, this was the policy in Britain, slowly but surely, the power of ideas, the logic of ideas, the importance of the freedom principle overcame all of the mercantilist interests, which was extremely powerful in Great Britain. It was the landed aristocracy. They were the ones who controlled the House of Lords. They had a significant portion, if not a majority, in the House of Commons most of this time. And there were many industries outside of agriculture who benefit from trade restrictions as well. But the power of ideas and the forming of coalitions as a pragmatic political matter, with Cobden Wright had to do to win the elections and then the votes in Parliament, was coalitions of those who clearly were hurt and harmed by it, both in Great Britain and, of course, was part of the British Empire at that time, places like Ireland. You were mentioning that Cobden and Bright got the support of the poor. There was a man named Daniel O'Connell. He was an Irishman who was a member of Parliament. He came from County Kerry in southwestern Ireland, and he would do parades through Ireland with crowds of advocates of free trade, in which they would pull an old-fashioned cannon, and attached to the cannon was a sign that said, "Free trade or this." Now, of course, they weren't meaning real insurrection, but they were pointing out that this was vital to the freedom and the liberty and prosperity of the people. Or there would be graffiti put on the walls of buildings in London as the people were starving due to the high cost of food due to the agricultural tariff barriers. And there would be this graffiti that would say things like, "I be protected and I be starved." In other words, okay, it was understood by, quote, the common man that these were merely ways of special interest groups who may have wrapped themselves in the flag and talked about the rhetoric of the common good and the general welfare. But basically, these were methods for special interest groups to be protected from the competitive winds of foreign rivals who could make products less expensive or better than they could. And rather than view this as a stimulus and to their own improvement and betterment to match the foreign competition, the constant appeal to run to the government. Now, if I can use one more example of an American businessman hero on this matter, and that was a man that I know that you, I believe, knew and met, and that was a businessman from Wisconsin named Bill Law. Now, Bill Law was a member at one time of the Board of Trustees of the Foundation for Economic Education. He was a friend of the founder of FEE, Leonard Reed. Now, when I was a teenager, first getting interested in these freedom ideas, starting to read these things, I would read the Wall Street Journal. And sometime back in the late 1960s, there appeared an opinion piece on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal by William Law. He ran a textile factory in Wisconsin. And I can still remember this editorial, the impression that it left on me. He said that there are members of my sector of the economy, the American textile industry, that are lobbying in Washington to raise the import barriers against the competition of all foreign textile manufacturers. If this legislation were to pass, I no doubt would be able to maintain my market share and my profit margins. I oppose my colleagues in the textile industry advocating import barriers against our foreign rivals. I view this as a form of denying freedom to the consumers and robbing the American public of money that they could save if they could purchase the foreign version of the product. I would rather go out of business than survive in business at the cost of the freedom of my fellow Americans. That is one of the most heroic and principled and articulate defenses by a businessman himself for this ideal. And long after, when I was a teenager and read it, I had the opportunity to meet Bill Law, and I shared it with him, and I told him the impact and impression that it had on a young mind in seeing that the importance and the courage of standing for these principles, even if the forces of the market do not always go your way. Now, that's the integrity and the courage and the principle that I wish more American businessmen would stand up and defend, because they, too, are citizens of what is supposed to be a free country, and they, too, are the consumers, along with all their other family members, who benefit when competition is allowed in other markets as well as their own.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that about Bill Law, because my reaction was the same. And when I met him, he told me about that, he was losing market share on baseball gloves, the leather gloves that baseball players use, because the Japanese were selling them at a much lower price, and that he stood his ground and said, no, I don't want any protectionist barriers. We will manage. But if we end up going out of business, so be it. And
that's right.
When I saw Law give a speech at the Foundation for Economic Education for my first seminar that I'd gone up there, I was so struck by the clarity by which he expressed these ideas on free trade and the principles that he would enunciate, that when I organized a fee seminar down in Laredo, where I was living at the time and practicing law, he was one of the speakers that I invited to come down. So he came down from Wisconsin to Laredo to speak at our seminar. And he was also part of this group called Council for a Competitive Economy that I know you'll recall, that was an organization that was composed of businessmen like him that took a solid, no-compromise stance, same type of stance we take at FFF. I mean, they were one of my models, to be honest with you. These group of national businessmen who said we will not compromise when it comes to free trade. And I would read the expositions being published by that organization when I was getting into libertarianism, and I was just so inspired and so struck by their principled attitude. And I agree with you, Richard. If only more businessmen would take that position today and then combine with the lower echelon of the economic classes who are getting damaged by this, the same thing under the free trade movement in England under Cobden and Bright, we could really bring this shift regardless of what Donald Trump or anybody of his ilk wants, because that, again, is the power of public opinion and the power of ideas on liberty. Richard, we're out of time, though. So, hey, greatly enjoyed the conversation as always this week, and look forward to talking to you next week as well.
Take care. Thank you for watching and listening.